Hello. Thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. When our boys were little, we had the opportunity to work with a church family in Guin, Alabama. We really loved the time that God allowed us to not only be part of that church, but to be a part of that community. Guin was a great place to raise two little boys, especially since our house backed up to a large wooded lot where the boys could spend their days running through the woods, catching bugs, and just having adventures. But one of the things that I loved most about living out in the country was the night sky. Every night we would go out and sit and talk and listen to the cicadas serenade us while we gazed up at the stars. Even though I can find the Big Dipper in the night sky, I'm not really skilled at finding any of the other constellations or even knowing the difference between what's a star and what's a planet. Maybe that's why I've always been fascinated by our passage for today. Starting in Matthew chapter 2, we read that Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem in the province of Judea at the time when King Herod reigned. Not long after Jesus was born, wise men from the east made their way from the east to Jerusalem. These wise men made inquiries asking, "Where is this newborn who is the King of the Jews? When we were far away in the east, we saw a star, and we have followed its gleam all this way to worship him." King Herod began to hear the rumors of the wise men's quest, and he and all of his followers in Jerusalem were worried. These are the only details that Matthew gives us about the early life of Jesus. Matthew doesn't take the time to tell us about the shepherds in the field or Jesus being presented at the temple or even Mary and Joseph leaving him behind in Jerusalem. This story about the wise men and Herod's horrific response are the only details that we get about the early life of Jesus. But I think it definitely fits into the greater story that Matthew's trying to tell. Now, don't forget that Matthew is written to a Jewish audience, and he's trying to point out the fact that Jesus is the king and the promised Messiah. From a Jewish point of view, it makes sense that he would begin with a genealogy trying to connect Jesus to Abraham and David, but Matthew does something next that causes us a little bit of pause. He includes this story about the wise men, which is this chaotic mix of worship and paranoia. The story starts by sharing with us that these wise men see a star and they know there's something important happening. There are all these ideas about what the wise men actually saw. Some people think that it might have been a comet or a supernova or maybe Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn all lined up in a way that caused these astrologers to take notice. And while we're not really sure what it was, we do know that it had their full attention. I've always been drawn to this part of the story, not so much because of the star, but it's because the star caused these men to do something. As soon as they noticed the star, they're so intrigued, they felt this deep need to leave the comfort of their homes and to take a very long journey. They understood that this was a special moment in time, and it caused them, it made them have this need to go and to find the reason for the star. They didn't have a promise of finding the answers or any guarantee of success, yet they were so intrigued, they had to move and do something. I think oftentimes we see things or we get intrigued by things or have our interest piqued by things, but it takes something really special to get us to move. It takes something important for us to leave our comfort zone and to put out the effort to make this trip, to search for something that we're not really sure we'll ever find. Yet when these men see this star, it does more than just catch their attention. It draws them to worship. You know, when we say worship, it's kind of been localized to a certain place and confined to a certain time. It's a very lovely religious sounding word that everybody knows, whether they would describe themselves as religious or not. In fact, almost every church uses the word worship to describe what they do when they come together for a set amount of time on a Sunday morning. And I think that could be a problem. Most church-going folks believe that they've experienced worship. They assume that they've been worshiping their entire lives. I mean, after all, the church bulletin says worship service, right? But do you really believe that's what these wise men from the East were intending to do when they found the reason for the star? The truth is, we're all worshipers, and that has nothing to do with a building or a certain day of the week. At its very core, worship is our response to what we value the most. We worship what holds the highest value in our lives, and that could be a relationship or a dream, social status, something you own, your job. It doesn't matter what it's called. The thing that you value the most is what you worship. That doesn't have anything to do with being religious. Worship fuels our actions. It becomes the driving force of everything that we do. And if you want to know where and what you worship, just acknowledge where you spend most of your time, your affection, your energy, your money, your allegiance. At the end of that trail, you'll find the throne of whatever or whoever sits on the throne and is the object of your worship. I understand you probably don't walk around and admit that you worship your stuff or social media or your job or your family or your favorite team or even yourself. But where you focus your time and your energy tells the truth of what you're spending your life worshiping. Robert Weber wrote a book one time entitled Worship is a Verb. I love that sentiment. I believe it's right. Worship is always a verb. Worship is something that you do, something you participate in, something you're intentional about. Yet I'm afraid that for many of us, we've reduced worship into something that we watch. I mean, most church buildings are set up in such a way that we give this impression that you come and watch worship. We set up the pews and the chairs to face the stage. We make sure that the lights point to the stage. We make sure the bulletin has an order of worship so you know what's happening in today's show. These wise men understood that worship is not something you attend like a film or a concert. Worship is something you do, something you participate in. They knew that worship is a verb. You know, if you were to casually read through the book of Psalms, you would find all of these verbs talking about worship. You would read that we're supposed to shout to God, sing a new song, dance before Him, clap your hands, bow down, lift up your hands, tell of His might, stand in awe, meditate on His truth, walk in His ways, cast down your idols, run to Him, make a loud noise, crash the cymbals, praise Him with trumpet, seek His face, tell the nations. At its very essence, worship is our response to God's greatness, to God's glory. A response that demands our mind, our soul, our heart, and our strength. But it's interesting to me that the very people that should have known the most about God, the chief priests, the scribes, even King Herod himself, they weren't drawn to worship Him. And on the other hand, those that knew the very least about worship, these pagan wise men from the East, they were drawn to Him, drawn to worship Him. That's why when they saw the star, they're willing to spend their time and their money to travel to go find this king. Men who practiced the occult, men that were schooled not only in astronomy, but also astrology, they understood something special, something different was happening. Something better had come. Not only did the star draw them to worship, it caused them to go west to put their very lives in danger. You see, the scene shifts rather dramatically in verse 3. I don't think that Matthew begins his gospel with this account because he wants to set up a picturesque storybook that's great to read to your kids as you put them to bed at night. Honestly, this is a very completely different story. It's a scandalous story. Wise men traveling to Jerusalem, and they're about to share information that's socially and politically explosive. It's dynamite. These wise men arrive and they're looking for Jesus, who they call the King of the Jews. But there's this problem. You see, Herod has already taken on that title, and they go see Herod and ask about the King of the Jews. Herod has told everybody that he is the King of the Jews, and he's not the type of man that would welcome anyone who would try to usurp his authority. Herod is this Roman appointed king of the area, but because of his family's origin, the Jews living in Jerusalem thought that he was at best an outsider. Herod was fiercely devoted to Rome, but he was a masterful diplomat. In an effort to endear himself to the Jews, he rebuilt the temple. And while you might be tempted to think that he was benevolent, behind the scenes, everyone knew that Herod was calculated, suspicious, and power hungry. As the self proclaimed king of the Jews, he's constantly looking over his shoulder for anyone that might be seen as a threat to his power, including his own children. History tells us that he guarded his throne with a bloody vengeance. He most assuredly wouldn't have taken kindly to this idea that anyone else claimed to be the king of the Jews. And to make matters worse, the wise men, they don't come and say that this newborn is going to take Herod's title. They say he's already taken it. They don't ask, where's the child that one day will grow up to become the king of the Jews? They ask, where is the newborn who is already, at this present moment, the king of the Jews? You understand that by simply asking the question, these foreigners caused Herod and the entire city to be troubled or worried, and for good reason. Everybody knew that arrival to Herod's throne is going to create problems. Everybody in the town is worried and anxious about what this news meant, or worse, how is Herod going to react? It seems at first Herod wants to handle it all quietly. After all, it's just a baby, right? How hard can it be to find a child and simply eliminate his competition? So Herod invites the chief priests and the scribes and asks them, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? They share with him this prophecy, and they seem to be unaware of what's happening, which is a long-standing problem with religious leaders. They knew where the Messiah was supposed to be born. They knew all of the prophecies about his coming, but that information never compels them to look for God. They thought that they were safe in their own little world, filled with their traditions and their structures. See, they don't have a problem with information, they have a problem with motivation. In a horrifying act of self-preservation, Herod quietly invites the wise men to his palace. I don't know, maybe he didn't want to give them credibility, but when he sends them away, he asks them to return with the baby's location because he's interested in finding the child. He also wants to go worship this king of the Jews. But you know that Herod had no intention to worship God. He's only interested in keeping his power and his position, even if that means killing an innocent baby. So the wise men are sent towards Bethlehem, and as they travel, the star appears in the sky again, the same star they had seen in the east, and that caused them to take this journey. They're overwhelmed with joy, and they follow the star to the place where Jesus was living. They rejoiced over a prophecy fulfilled that they never knew. They worshiped a God who had called another people, and they even offered Jesus gifts fit for a king: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. While this is the end of their journey, they've finally been able to accomplish what they've desperately wanted to do, this is not the end of their story. I believe they fully intended to go back to Jerusalem and to share the good news with Herod, yet God tells them in a dream they need to go home a different way, which is exactly what they do. And after a time of waiting, Herod realizes that he's been duped. The wise men are not coming back. And in this moment of fury and loathing, he commands that all of the boys that live in Bethlehem or near Bethlehem and were the age of 2 or younger, they're to be taken out of their homes, ripped out of their mother's arms, dragged into the streets, and slaughtered. Worship or loathing. Those are really our only 2 choices. And before you protest too quickly and say, there's a lot of different ways to respond to Jesus, maybe we need to unpack this a little bit. In Matthew's gospel, we discover that not only is Jesus our King and promised Messiah, we discover that everyone is invited to know him and to worship him. It's not an accident that Matthew tells the story of a couple of foreign stargazers and their desires to come and to find and to worship God. The point of Matthew's gospel is that we're all invited to have a relationship with God, to acknowledge him as our King, our Messiah. A little later in Matthew's gospel, he's going to retell the parable of the wedding feast. In that parable, we discover that there's this great king who throws a feast to celebrate his son's wedding, and he invites all sorts of people to come. The problem is the people that he invited first rejected his invitation. So the king sends his servants out to the crossroads, and they invite everybody that passed by, and the result is that the house is full of people. People that did not previously know the king or his son show up for the celebration. In the same way, Jesus comes and invites everyone to know and to worship him. All races, nations, colors, all kinds of people are invited to come. There's no one who's too different, too sinful, too good, too disabled. God is at this very moment filling his kingdom with people who want to love him and to know him and to serve him. But there are also people in the world that loathe him. I know when we think about folks who loathe God, we think about those who openly oppose God, people that are hateful, that deny his existence. But the truth is, there might be others out there that loathe God by not giving their lives to him. I understand when we make the decision to follow Jesus, it's really tempting to hold back a little piece of our lives, and I think maybe we've all done it to some degree. We all seem to hold on to that one or two sins that aren't that really bad, that we're only going to do every now and then, and it doesn't really hurt anybody. This is just a little indulgence for us. And after all, I mean, Jesus isn't going to notice a tiny sin, right? Or at least that's the way we tend to justify our behavior. I know that we're called to worship God by loving him with all of our heart, mind, soul, body, strength. But honestly, if I forget to study my Bible, is it really that big a deal? I mean, if I miss a chance to be with my church family because I'm tired or I have something better to do, does that really matter? I know it's been a few days since I've prayed, but I've been busy, and I mean, is God even listening anymore? Whether you understand it or not, if you are not worshiping God with all of your heart, if you just show up and go through the motions, then you are choosing to loathe him. Or at least that's what Jesus seems to be saying in Luke 14, verse 26. If anyone comes to me but loves his father, mother, wife, children, brothers, or sisters, or even life more than me, he cannot be my follower. Living a life of worship is an all or nothing proposition. You either worship God with everything you have, or you loathe him. There's no other option. Jesus left the glories of heaven and was willing to come and to be embarrassed, humiliated, tortured, and even killed so that we could experience the beautiful gift of mercy and grace. So when God calls us to come and follow him, he has the right to demand that our love for him exceeds our love for everything else. We must love God more than we love our family members. We must love God more than our possessions. We must love God more than our favorite sports team, more than our jobs, more than ourselves. And that has to be visible in the way that we live our lives. Honestly, did you spend more time with Jesus last week or social media? Did you spend more effort living for Jesus than you did chasing after your hobbies? Are you more excited about God or some logo or team name that's written across the chest of your favorite t-shirt? Do you devote more time trying to make a dollar or living like Jesus? Unless you love Jesus more than all of these things, you're not worshiping him. You're living a life that shows that you loathe him. As we make our way to the tables this morning, we're going to have to ask ourselves, are we living a life of worship? Are we completely dedicated to God? Or are we holding stuff back and loathing him quietly? Have we fallen into the trap of just sitting in a building and singing holy, holy, holy while not being completely committed to him? Or does God have our complete dedication? This morning as we take the bread and the cup, we're being called to remember that Jesus has already given everything for us. But more than that, we're being asked, are we willing to give everything to him, or are we holding things back? I know you don't understand this because I struggle with it a lot. I think we all do. But when we go to the table, what we're recognizing is that Jesus has given us everything. And he requires us to give him everything in return. And if we don't, what we are saying is, Jesus, I love you, but I love this more. In reality, what we're saying is, Jesus, what I love is this, and I loathe you because I could take you or leave you. And Jesus didn't leave us. Jesus did everything that was required so that we could have a relationship with him. And so this morning, as you go to the tables, it's my hope and my prayer that you spend some time thinking about, where is God on your list of priorities? Are you worshiping him with your life? Or are you just going through the motions and actually loathing him? Because at the end of the day, those are your only two options. Worship him or loathe him. And God is a God of love and mercy that fully deserves our life, our love, and our worship. I hope you have a wonderful week and a great time around the table. I look forward to seeing you very soon.